Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Back in May of 2010, my best friend Andy and I wanted to make a video game that we thought was going to change virtual reality gaming and the horror genre forever. We were both out of university, me with a degree in computer programming and him with digital art design. Both of us were avid gamers. I think we played a bit of just about everything. Racing, JRPGs, MMOs, sports, you name it. We wanted to make a game unlike anything you could get coming from overseas. You could call it an ambitious goal for a couple of aspiring indie gamers, but both of us were ambitious guys. Andy was a big fan of horror, and was actually the first to come up with the idea. We'd heard of the four-dimensional theaters that were being introduced in places like Korea and London, where you weren't just watching a movie, but feeling it and smelling it. If the movie was set in a pine forest, there were triggers that would release the scent of pine to the audience. Likewise, if the characters were standing on the windy deck of a ship, fans would start blowing to mimic the conditions of the movie in the theater. All of it was to create a more realistic, interactive experience for the viewer, and we thought it would be awesome to try to implement that with a 4D game. Obviously, we didn't have the manpower to make an entire game by ourselves. We were in a lot of debt because of school and wouldn't have been able to afford the virtual reality hardware in our wildest dreams. That, and we had no idea how to develop the technology we needed to create the 4D gaming experience. Throughout the following summer, we networked like crazy, pitching our ideas to different developers, both indie and big-time. There was interest, but the 4D concept was still very much in development, and no one was sure they wanted to invest time and resources in it without the assurance it was going to hit it off. I won't bore you with the details of how it happened, but we finally hit a breakthrough in September when an independent company called Systelien contacted us after our attempts to pitch the idea to them. They thought it had potential and were interested in onboarding us as writers and programmers. The company itself would take the rights for the game, of course, and there'd be a team that would make the final decisions during all stages of development. It was still more than we could have ever hoped for. There was a team of 150 people, a third of who were hardware developers. The controller was built into a padded, inclined chair with a minimalist headset that fits around the player's eyes and ears. The joystick and buttons could be swapped on the arms to accommodate if the player was left-handed or right-handed. Really high-tech, right? Where the money was really sunk was in the environmental simulators and the sensors and nodes that would be attached to the player's body to monitor their physical status. Like I said, the game was meant to be a horror game. We settled on the story of an unnamed character going into a haunted mansion to get rid of evil spirits and getting stalked by a demon. The most cliched plot and setting you could think of, but that was what we were going for. We wanted something that would easily be associated with fear. The idea was that the demon fed off fear and would find you more easily if you were afraid. First, it would scare and drive the character crazy, then it would kill him or her. The monitors attached to the player analyzed the physical signs that the player was afraid: rapid heartbeat, dilated pupils, harsh breathing, clammy or sweaty skin, etc., and use that information to determine how aggressively the demon would act. You could think of it as a social experiment. You could see how well the person would stay calm under pressure. Theoretically, a completely calm person could make it through the entire game without much danger, but the scares and the atmosphere wouldn't let you get through the first level without making you anxious. The real fun started once the demon came after you. We wanted to keep it subtle. No jump scares. That was cheating the player out of the experience. If you think about it, people with real paranormal experiences never report a demon breaking through a glass window or going for your throat. They report brushes against the skin, a whispering in the ears, and a loud sound in the distance, even tingling or electrical sensations. Those were the kinds of things we created. We programmed the system to deliver those audio and sensory cues when the player reached a certain level of anxiety. The more scared you were, the more scares you received. At the beginning of the game, you might hear heavy breathing or footsteps behind you. You might even feel cold spots as you navigated the mansion. As you progressed and became tenser, you might feel a grip on your arm from a blood pressure-like cushion on the chair that tightened around the muscle, or a hiss directly in your ear along the feeling of the breath. It was elaborate and it took forever to produce, but when they hooked you in, it was amazing. I had the privilege of being the one to test it as it was being produced. They put me in the chair, turned off all the lights, and would play the game through the headset as well as project the images that you were seeing onto a wall so that the team could see it too. The graphics were realistic. They got the rooms of the mansion down to the last detail. About a year and a half after the sensors were developed and implemented into the system, we started looking for beta testers. We started advertising in magazines and message boards for people to come in blind and play the game, giving any criticism or reporting any glitches they experienced. The majority of the feedback we received was positive, and for several revisions we could safely say that we had a successful project. Of particular note were the reports from the beta testers in which they claimed to get the feeling that someone was in the room with them, or that they were getting tingling or hot and cold sensations in parts of their body where the nodes were not attached. The room where the chair and the interface were located was kept clear, aside from the player, as often as possible. The team was separated from the room by a one-way mirror. You would have been able to see if anyone was in the room apart from the player, and in 9 out of 10 cases when this was reported, there was no one. The other 1/10 were a technician that was coming in to check the interface. There were times when we would disable and re-enable certain audio and sensory simulations to further test which ones gave more stimuli than others. During one playthrough, the player might have cold spots, and then during the next, those would be disabled. We never told the players which ones were activated and which were not. The strangest cases came when someone playing the game for the first time would report a cue when it was clearly disabled. In one particular case, a middle-aged woman reported her hair being tugged gently. I can tell you that right now. That had not been programmed into the game at that point in time. It was an odd occurrence, but one that could have easily been chalked up to imagination. Actually, we assume that most of the cases like this were due to the power of suggestion. We just cautioned the rest of the beta testers not to talk about what they went through so that people coming in could get as an authentic experience as possible. As tends to happen in these situations, people started spreading rumors. Some of my favorite rumors were the ones that made the Systelien staff out to be cultists who were secretly sacrificing the beta testers to the demon portrayed in the game. I have no idea how that one held up as long as it did, since there were absolutely no reports of injuries on or off-site, and every single one of the testers came out of the building alive. The internet and gossip do strange things to people, I guess. However, rumors like that were starting to give Systelien a bad reputation. We decided it was time to bring in the media to defeat some of these rumors. We hadn't wanted to have reporters before for fear that other gaming companies would try to copy our methods, but now seemed like a good time as any. We got several offers and wound up taking one from a popular gaming magazine. The reporting team came in and interviewed us about the games and the 4D techniques used. We used the opportunity to show them around the building and debunk the rumors about animal and human sacrifice. It was actually pretty funny. After the interview, the reporting team wanted to try out the game for themselves. They all had good things to say about it, and when the article was published, donations and other requests for interviews began streaming in. Andy and I said we should have let the media come in sooner for all the benefits we were getting. The more we searched Systelien's message boards, the more we started noticing threads crop up about people who claimed they were experiencing the things in the game after they had left Systelien and gone home. They were going through the same supernatural phenomenon in their everyday lives as they had in the game. In every claim, they said they would feel as though someone was getting very, very close to them, looking over their shoulders and breathing down their necks. I guess that was one thing about the demon in the game that we had neglected to mention. It had no sense of personal space. The reports eventually involved both minor and violent poltergeist activity, and people would be going through this for days afterward. The reports helped to spread the word even more, but it didn't help the persisting rumors that the testers were being possessed. The most popular thread, where the reports were being archived, affectionately called the demon causing these incidences, the Systelien demon or the Systelien Specter. I like the Systelien Specter better. Then came the day when a young man, only 17 years old, we'll call him John, claimed that he wanted to file a lawsuit against us as he'd been scratching during his time playing the game. As I remember it, John had been doing fine up until when he reached the basement of the mansion and then had screamed for us to let him out. The only evidence of the scratches were a set of pictures taken after he had exited the building. The scratches shown on the pictures were deep and red, clearly not something that had been dealt by a human, maybe by a machine, but an inspection of the chair revealed no sharp parts sticking out. The lawsuit was eventually dropped, since there was no way to prove he hadn't scratched himself prior to coming in. It's not like we do a full body examination before sitting our testers down into the chair. It was at this point we decided to stop bringing in random beta testers and test the game ourselves for the last stages of development. I was one of the first to be strapped in. They had added so much stuff to the gameplay and so many more cues that I barely recognized it from the first time I'd played. I remember going down the foyer staircase after exploring a series of darkened hallways lit by old Victorian-era lamps, feeling my palms sweat and the hairs on my back of my neck standing on end. The wind outside the mansion had been howling for the last half hour, and it sounded like someone was whistling a funeral march. I paused on the stairs to look at the windows, searching for any weird textures needing to be fixed, when I felt a tingling along my spine on my upper back, like someone was pressing his or her chest against my back. It wasn't just in the game. I could feel the press in reality. I reached up and felt only the chair. The thing that really set me off, though, was the voice that spoke my name in my ear. It was whispered and very clear, no mistaking it for the wind. I spun the camera around, though I knew there would be nothing to see. The demon had always been invisible. Now I knew why some of our testers had joked about feeling violated while playing. I just assumed Andy had played a joke on me, but he swore up and down that he didn't put any coding in the game for the demon to say the player's name. That would have been my department, not his. He just assigned skins. Still, I remained convinced that someone was just having fun with me. There wasn't even a place to input your name. Someone must have pre-recorded it. I played through the rest of the area and then headed home to file my report. It was another late night. I had been pulling the late shift for a couple of weeks as our deadline was growing closer. We had been having decent weather until about 2 a.m. when the wind picked up and the rain was coming down in buckets. Andy and I had come from the Midwest and were used to bipolar weather. I just worked on and paid it no mind. Until the power went out, anyway. I grabbed my flashlight, feeling all the anxiety for my time in the game returning. This was a different story, though, and I knew that. My house wasn't haunted, and I had never believed in ghosts for my entire life. My brain said it was just ridiculous, but my pounding heart told a different story. I couldn't help but feel every draft and hear every creak of the floorboards as I went down to the generator, which of course was in the cellar. The wooden steps led me down into the darkness, and I have to admit that by the time I reached the concrete, I was considering just going back upstairs and burrowing myself into my bed. I forced myself to cross the floor to the generator and turn it on. Immediately, the backup lights flickered on, casting a red hue over the dusty shelves and rusty tools in the workbench. So, now I got to be in hell, too. The way back wasn't nearly as bad as the way down, and I reminded myself that everything I had experienced in the game had just been that. In the game. There was nothing to worry about. The demon, the Systelien Specter, or whatever, was an enemy made out of ones and zeros. It couldn't do anything to me. I was halfway up the stairs, about at the same point I'd been in the game, when I'd heard my name, actually. When I distinctly felt someone tightly grab my wrists, as in squeezing like my wrists were being juiced tight. I screamed and dropped the flashlight, which went off on impact. There was no one there, but I still slapped it where I imagined the hand had come from and clambered up the stairs. I didn't stop until I was out the front door and in my driveway, getting drenched and not caring. I whipped out my cell phone and punched in Andy's number. He said he knew how I felt. During his test play, though, he'd accidentally backed his character into a fire since he had been so busy keeping an eye on the rest of the room. We had all laughed at the mistake, but he hadn't mentioned the fact that after we had taken him out of the game, he'd felt a burning in his lower calf. Later, when he looked at his leg after getting home, he discovered he had a first-degree burn right where his character had touched the fire. I drove to his house and looked at his leg myself. He'd already spread ointment on the area and bandaged it up, but when he pulled it back, I was staring at a red and swollen burn wound. Out of morbid curiosity, I called the other members of our team who had tested the game that day. It was the same story all around. In the game, Jill had stood in front of a window that had shattered and then cut her hands while picking up the jagged pieces of a ceramic vase that suddenly had fallen to the floor. Matthew's character had been crushed by a falling bookshelf, and then, when he'd been getting into his car, his door had closed when he wasn't ready, and 3 fingers had been broken. I looked at my wrists again, where dark purplish bruises were forming. These couldn't be coincidences anymore. I didn't know what was going on, but it wasn't just a game anymore. The next day was a holiday, so everyone at Systelien was off. I invited anyone willing to go back to the game room to try and play through the game one more time. Andy and I had gone through the possibilities. The point of the entire game had been for the character to go into the mansion to exorcise the demon. They could do it by collecting special candles, then lighting them in a circle in the attic in the mansion. After some other steps were done, the demons would be forced out of the house, and everything would go back to normal. It had been a crazy night, and at any other time, I thought we would have been crazy for discussing these things. We thought that maybe, by completing the game, and by extension the ritual, we could stop whatever the hell was going on. After all, no one, to this day, had ever finished the game from beginning to end. The game was as complete as it was ever going to be. Andy volunteered to play, for which I was grateful. Maybe it was cowardly, but I didn't want to be the one to go in. The room was frigidly cold as we attached the nodes. We threw a blanket over Andy to make sure he didn't freeze. The rest of us, 5 in total, not including Matthew, who'd gone to the hospital to treat his hand, gathered behind the one-way glass to watch. It was eerie, watching his progress through the game. I knew all of those corridors so well, having labored over their game files for months. Yet now everything looked new, now that I was sure that I knew what the game was capable of. I watched Andy's heart rate rise and fall on my monitor. His skin temperature analyzers went haywire as he rounded every corner. As was supposed to happen, he felt the demon close in when his fear spiked. But this time around, its interactions were low-key, almost subdued. I fought against my suspicion that it was just biding its time. The demon was made of ones and zeros. Numbers can't hurt anyone. I thought this even as I rubbed my bruised wrists. It took 4 hours for Andy to make it all the way through. He didn't even take a bathroom break. He just wanted to get this done as much as we did. He crept through the halls, doing his best to keep calm despite the advances of the demon. He collected the 6 candles needed for the ritual and made his way up to the attic. Then things started happening that were definitely not in the programming. The paintings and potted plants in the game began shaking and flying off the walls, clearly aimed for his character. In the safety of the monitoring room, 2 filing cabinets overturned before sliding across the floor and knocking down 2 staff members. Wires attached to the wall disconnected and sprayed sparks around the room. Grabbing a fire extinguisher, I prepared to extinguish any flames that cropped up. Andy had placed the candles on the floor of the attic and was using an old lighter to light them. He was able to get the 4th candle lit before he suddenly bucked in his chair, screaming for us to stop the game. When we rushed in, I saw his hands flailing, as though he was trying to tear off the nodes and sensors glued to his body. Maybe that was part of it, but when I got a closer look, I realized he was fighting with something invisible that was holding him down in the chair. His shirt and face had been slashed, and blood dribbled from the wounds. I was afraid I was going to break his arm since I was pulling so hard to get him off the chair. Finally, we got him free and out of the room, slamming the door behind us. Andy's character had already died, and the game over screen mocked us as we scrambled to call an ambulance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the day and the following night as I waited in the hospital. Andy's wounds were worse than we thought. There was a massive amount of internal bleeding that we hadn't known about. The doctors tried to stem the blood loss with transfusions, but their efforts were for nothing. Andy passed away early in the morning. A week later, I saw a news special about the death and its connection to the game and Systelien. I couldn't blame whoever had blabbed. The police blamed Andy's death on the system malfunctioning, as though that could explain the scratches and the internal trauma. Our supervisors didn't care. They ordered the project to be shut down, and I was grateful. I never wanted to see that game again. The only way I was ever going back to the Systelien building was if that room was demolished and the chair dismantled. Though, to be honest, I wouldn't have been surprised if anyone who tried to take it apart was attacked as well. I left the company when the announcement was made that the game would be discontinued. People on the forums expressed everything from disappointment to relief. The game was over. For weeks, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. I moved away from the town and the memories I had of Andy. My co-workers held a farewell party for me, despite the fact that they probably had the right to blame me for everything. They said that I had helped make a game that would never be forgotten by anyone who played it. That was all well and good, but I was desperate to forget and spend the rest of my life trying to do so. I was always keeping 2 eyes on the shadows and jumping at every little creak. There was this little fear that I would hear my name whispered in my ear again, which would mean that whatever I had created had followed me, and I never wanted to think about that possibility. The only thing I could do was try to sleep and ignore the times when I felt an invisible, clammy hand stroke my face. Luke stepped out of the warm comfort of his best friend's house into the cold winter air. The sun was quickly slipping beneath the horizon, and the trees of the forest cast long, twisted shadows across the yard. Luke said goodbye to his friend and thanked his mother for having him over. As their goodbyes drew to a close, the front door swung shut, and a silence fell over Luke. He stared out across the lawn into the twilight forest that awaited him. It was only a 15-minute walk from his friend's house to his own, and he had made that walk countless times before. But as he watched the night descend upon the world, something sinister began to fill the shadows. Luke knew what was coming next. It didn't happen often, but he knew tonight it would be coming for him. There was an acute sense of dread in the air, and he could almost feel its gaze watching him from the ever-lengthening shadows. Luke stepped off his friend's porch and into the night. Luke crossed the 30 yards from the porch to the beginning of the forest path with little incident, but as he entered the woods, he entered another realm. No longer did he live in the world of modern conveniences where a warm, bright home was only a short walk away. In its stead was a primeval existence where danger lurked in every shadow, and his only salvation was a night's march away. Luke had been walking for a little over a minute when it began. Far in the distance, standing between two trees, it was there, standing motionless, watching him, its twisted figure lit by the dying rays of the sun. No sooner had Luke seen it than it was gone, and with it vanished the last vestiges of daylight. The hunt was on. Luke began to move faster, but he had to hold himself back, knowing if he broke into a run it would soon chase him down. This was not Luke's first time seeing the thing, and after enough encounters he had learned the rules. He was not to run or scream, or it would be angry. If it was angry, Luke received a deep gash on his arm or leg. Luke had been fortunate to never anger it further. Luke knew if he kept calm and walked home, the thing would not punish him. It would be terrifying, but he'd arrive home alive. The first time he saw it, he'd run home with his heart ready to rip itself out of his chest. He received a nasty cut down his leg for his troubles, and he arrived home dirty, bloody, and trembling. He'd stumbled into the house and sunk to the floor, shaking and crying. When he told his mother what had happened, she dismissed the whole thing as a product of his overactive imagination. She promised to get rid of the thorn bush that had scratched him and told him to calm down. Since then, he'd stopped telling his mom when he saw it, and when the thing cut him, he hid it from her. Not only did his mother blame his imagination, but so did everyone else he tried to tell. His father, his brother, even his best friend blamed his overactive imagination. His father and brother had told him to stop playing pretend and act his age. Luke was alone with his twisted companion. Luke continued onward, trying to contain his fear. Every second he fought the urge to scream and run for his life. Luke knew that it would appear at any moment. He might turn a corner and it would be in the middle of the path. He might glance to the side and see it behind the nearest tree, but no matter what, he never saw it for long. Luke wasn't even sure what it looked like, as it never stayed in sight long enough for him to set its appearance into his memory. But although he rarely saw it, its presence never left. Whether it was noxious smells of filth and blood, ragged panting, or drooling, Luke knew the thing was always close by. The walk was stretching into an eternity for Luke. He felt as though he had left his friend's house hours ago, and yet it seemed there were miles and miles left to walk until he was home. Luke began to pick up the pace a little, and as his step quickened, he heard a shuffling gait behind him begin to rustle the leaves. This was incredibly odd, as he had never heard its footsteps before. They were close. Not so close that Luke was considering bolting. Oddly, these heavy footfalls made Luke feel better. He knew he couldn't possibly be imagining them. He could hear leaves rustle and crunch underneath the pursuer's feet. He could hear it physically impacting the world. Surely that couldn't be his imagination. Time dragged on, and Luke could hear the footsteps growing closer and closer. His already strained heart began to beat even faster. After a while, Luke could hear the footsteps directly behind him. The thing was just waiting for Luke to turn around and look at it, but he would not succumb. He knew as soon as he stopped or looked behind him, the thing would devour him. Just as Luke was ready to give in and run for it, the footsteps stopped. Luke was so surprised he faltered, and as he slowed, he felt the thing's breath brush along his neck. As the acrid fumes swept around him, he almost fainted, but by some miracle he was able to keep his feet. Luke gathered his senses and kept on walking. Behind him, the thing let out a murderous shriek. As though it were angered Luke had not succumbed to its taunts. Luke was more frightened than ever, but he refused to give in to the thing. Luke shoved his hands into his pockets, stared at his shoes, and picked up the pace. Luke kept on his way for several minutes, and for several minutes all was quiet. Luke began to hope that tonight's nightmare was over. As he raised his head to check his surroundings, his eyes fell upon the feet of his pursuer. He was standing there in the middle of the path, waiting for him. Luke refused to look. He stared at its vile feet, refusing to meet its demonic gaze. Its feet were sick and disfigured, with yellow, cracked talons protruding from them. The largest one was curved like a raptor's and stained with blood. The skin was a sickly pale yellow and covered in pockmarks and warts. The arch of the foot was inhuman and twisted almost like a coiled spring. Luke was almost sick, but again he found a way to keep himself under control. Almost as soon as Luke had taken in the thing's sick feet, they were gone. Luke could take no more. He broke into a run. He knew the thing would be furious, but he no longer cared. He just wanted the terror to end. As he ran, he heard the thing stomping behind him. Its footfalls were thunderous, and it let out a bloody shriek. Luke could hear the fury in its cry, and it drove him to run even faster. Luke could tell he was close to home. If he could hold out for 30 more seconds, he could make it out of the woods. The thing's footfalls drew even closer, and Luke was almost ready to give up. His legs were moving slower and slower by the second. His lungs were burning with each breath, and his face was growing cold, as though his blood were seeping out of it. Luke caught sight of the edge of the woods, and with one maniacal last burst of energy kept going. He heard the thing closing in. Its screams grew frenzied as it prepared to kill, but just as Luke began to feel the thing's claws sink into its shoulders, he burst beyond the tree line and onto his own lawn. Luke stumbled to his porch, wheezing the whole way. He dragged himself onto the steps and collapsed, trembling as adrenaline coursed through his exhausted body. Luke lay there in silence, trying to recover from the horrid experience, when from the woods Luke heard a rabid snuffling. He raised his head, dreading what he might see. From out of the woods emerged the thing. Luke had no idea what to do. The thing always disappeared when he left the woods. The thing had broken its own rules, and Luke was too exhausted to do anything but watch it draw closer to him. As it came closer, he began to see it in ever greater detail as it stepped into his porch light. The thing was hideous beyond belief. It was disgusting and unnatural. It had one huge red eye in the middle of its face. Below it was a crooked gash of a mouth that hung open, revealing a veritable hacksaw of black and bloody teeth. It had no nose or ears, and its head was covered in limp spikes. Its shoulders were uneven, as one arm was gimpy and the shoulder twisted. The arm was withered and hung by the creature's side. Its other arm was massive and had claws matching those on its feet. The claws extended down to the ground and dragged as it marched forward. Its spine was twisted, and it seemed a miracle that the thing could even walk. Luke stared in horror as it approached. He knew he was facing his death. He was too physically and mentally exhausted to do anything but stare into the disfigured face of death. But extraordinarily, as the thing drew within 5 feet of him, it stopped. It stopped and stared at him. Luke did not know for how long they made eye contact, but after a while, the thing simply turned and ran off into the woods, far faster than Luke ever thought its twisted frame could move. Luke lay there for some time until he could muster the energy to stumble into his home. When he returned, his mother's only remark was that he was late, and he should know better than to make her worry like that. Luke numbly stumbled into his room and collapsed. He didn't sleep soundly that night, nor would he for many nights to come, but he thanked God he had survived. He didn't know what made the thing turn back. Maybe it had some sort of twisted sense of honor that stopped it from killing a defenseless boy, or maybe it just wanted to preserve him for another night of sport. Luke didn't know, and Luke didn't care. He was just thankful to be alive. That same night, another young boy returned home late. He scrambled through the dirt with his cracked and yellowed claws into the entrance of his home. As he lumbered into the dank cavern that it was his home, the boy's mother demanded to know where he'd been. The boy was out of breath and sweating from his earlier exertions. He could barely get out a response to his mother. He told her that he had seen the thing again. His mother told him to stop playing pretend and go to bed. He protested that he had gotten close to it this time, looked at it, and even touched it. He told her how hideous it was, with its smooth pink skin and its squashed face, with its 2 beady eyes, but it didn't seem dangerous. He didn't know why. It always ignored him when he tried to be friendly, and tonight it had run away again. He felt bad because it often cut itself on all the thorns along the path when it run. His mother told him to shut down his overactive imagination and stop telling her such ridiculous stories. He grumbled as he shuffled into his room and lay down in his bed of worms to go to sleep. He would get the thing to talk to him one day. He just had to keep on trying. The thing often walked through the yard at night. He would just say hi to it again in a week. I know most of you have heard plenty of stories of possessed evil dolls, or cursed toys that have caused who knows how much damage to their owners. But let me tell you, sometimes it's the most mundane things that can really freak you out. Unfortunately, I was too ignorant to help the one person who really needed my help at the time, but I hope it isn't too late to warn others, especially since it might be too late for me. There's a guy who lived next door to me. He wasn't at the end of the street or in some old drafty house. It was just a regular old colonial, but the guy was obsessed with Legos. I don't know if he was ever featured on the news or not, but he always had something new set up in his front yard. In February, he built a big heart with a life-sized Lego man proposing to a Lego woman, which was actually pretty neat. In July, he reenacted that famous photo of the Iwo Jima flag raising. It was a little silly, maybe, but with yellow Lego heads on the army men. But, again, it was certainly nothing to sneeze at. But Halloween was when he went all out. Lego wolfmen, Lego vampires, Lego webs. He even had all of those torture device things he put up, like the rack, an Iron Maiden, thumb screws, even things that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Saw movie. Thing is, not only did he build stuff really well, but most of it worked. The proposing Lego man's arm actually could move up and down. The 2 Iwo Jima flags, bendy, and could wave if pulled. And all those Halloween things? Yep, the Iron Maiden could close, and all those little traps could actually twist and turn. Not that anyone could hurt themselves. All the spikes in the Iron Maiden were missing, and the thumbscrew didn't actually drop, but I didn't even know that level of detail was possible. As far as the guy himself, he wasn't exactly what you expected from a 30-something guy who collected Legos. He was tall, fairly athletic, clean-shaven, no glasses. Even smelled like he showered regularly. But I guess collectors come in all shapes and sizes. He was always friendly with the neighborhood kids, and he'd even let them play with the stuff on the lawn, as long as they didn't steal anything. Not that anyone really could, as on closer look, the Legos were all glued together. I assumed superglue, but whatever it was strong. I know one kid almost broke a nail trying to get one off once. It really made the neighborhood special in a lot of ways, not the least of which, because at Christmas, he would send a few lucky kids in the neighborhood their own special toys. My own kids had been looking forward to getting their toys for a long time, but it hadn't happened yet. But then there was Chris. Chris was a teenager in the neighborhood who had a long history of discipline problems. He came from a broken home and was having issues in the foster system. He lashed out a lot in school. I knew him because I taught there, and he was in my math class. When I saw him struggling with his lessons, I offered to tutor him after school in the campus library, and he seemed to respond to it and to me. Still, I was sure that even if he trusted me more than most people, there was a lot he wouldn't tell me. I was pretty sure he stole little things like candy bars and other criminal acts. Nothing I could prove, and quite frankly, I liked him, and the less I knew about what he did when he wasn't in school, the better. It was a week or two after Halloween, just after dinner, when I got a knock on the door. It was Chris, and he had something under his coat. Oh, no, here it was. He asked me to sit outside with him for a minute. I got my coat, and he sat down with me on a bench in my front garden. Teach, there's something weird going on, and I don't know who else to tell. I can't go to the cops, because I didn't exactly find out about it legally. He reached out into his coat and pulled out a hammer. To look at it, it was like any other claw hammer you would see in a store, except it was entirely made out of Legos, top to bottom. The claw was even put together with the pointy pieces I hadn't seen in sets in a long time. I've never seen a children's toy look so intimidating. It shouldn't have been, with all the yellow, blue, and red bricks making it up, but as it had been glued together with very strong glue, I'm pretty sure you could have done some damage with it. Chris, where'd you get this? I didn't need to ask, since I already knew, but the answer he gave still surprised me. That Lego guy. I wanted to see all the stuff in his basement, since I didn't get a chance to go over there on Halloween. But he had a door open in there, a door that you don't see when it's closed, going under the stairs. There's a chair in there, and this. He shook it. As strange as all this was, I didn't believe his story. I wanted to, because I wanted to believe he was a good kid, but I couldn't. As weird as a Lego hammer was, there was nothing wrong with it, and he had broken into a house. I didn't want to rat him out, but didn't know how to tell him without being a jerk about it. Chris, how about you talk to me about it tomorrow after class? If you took that from the house, it's probably not going to help too much if they know you took that. He looked a little downcast that I didn't immediately go walking over there, but he didn't seem to be upset. Okay, but be careful. The stuff in his basement, other than that, is weird. I think he's up to something, Teach, and I don't want anything to happen to you. After Chris left, I looked over at the Lego guy's house. I figured he was a little odd with all his stuff, but criminal? Probably not. What was there to worry about? I got worried when Chris was not in school the next day. Nobody had seen him. I called his foster home, and they said he hadn't come back the night before. They'd already called the police themselves, afraid he had run away. Now, very concerned, after school I went to my neighbor's house. His Thanksgiving decorations, usually up by now, were conspicuously absent. I knocked, but he still didn't answer. Just on a whim, I tried the front door and found it was open. I didn't know if I should go in, but considering what I had heard the day before, I wanted to be sure everything was okay. I called in, asking if there was anyone there. I got no answer. I peeked in. In the front hall, there were the Thanksgiving Legos, a giant turkey, and pilgrim hat, but they were shoved against the wall, like they were pushed out of the way in a hurry. I called out again and noticed the basement door open. If I had known then what I know now, I would have just gone back and called the police and let them handle it. I guess more than anything, I was concerned about Chris than I was about how strange all of this was. But I went into the basement. The place was full of Lego constructions. You could barely walk for all the things that were shoved onto there, ranging from life-sized Lego people to scale model aircraft carriers, holiday decorations, and God knows what else. He had never put up even half of what he had built on display. And quite frankly, I was glad. Some of the things he had ranged from normal to downright disturbing. He had a model of the Telltale Heart built, with the psycho staring at the floor while the police stared at him in horror. The French Revolution, with the guillotine dropped and several Lego heads in a basket. And beyond those, some grotesque creature, all twists and turns, with no discernible head. It looked all wrong. A sculptured dolly would have had nightmares about. And it was eating Lego people in a scale model city. The Iron Maiden in the corner was shut, along with the other Halloween decorations, but there was no sign of anyone living anywhere. I went along the staircase, but I didn't see any room. I felt along the shelves attached to it, loaded with all the regular Lego fun sets you normally see, and found what felt like a handle built into the underside of one. It turned, and with the click, the hidden door opened. Inside was a small room, more a closet than anything. A single light bulb hung over a chair, with a table next to it in darkness. I pulled the lamp cord. On that table was the hammer Chris had shown me the other day, and next to it was a pile of teeth. I gagged and ran out of the closet. I stumbled over the proposing Lego man and knocked him over. For the first time, the glue cracked and his hand fell off. Underneath was a shriveled human hand. I scrambled up and down and saw the Iron Maiden once more in the corner. This time I saw a puddle beneath it, and a pair of eyes in the slot of its door. Even though I couldn't see them clearly, I somehow knew they were Chris's eyes. I called the police. All signs showed Lego Guy had left town that morning, though they put out an APB for him. They found more bodies hiding inside the Lego figures. I didn't want to know more when they said it could be more than 15, all mummified and sealed away in their toy coffins. And the torture devices? DNA swabs showed they'd been used many times. They didn't know whose DNA it was, and since they had no one to compare it to, but many samples had been found. And Chris, I should have listened to him. I was shaken when they pulled his body out of the house. They still haven't caught him. He could be anywhere by now, in any town, putting up displays, maybe not Legos anymore, but I know he'll do anything to impress. I know because some boxes came in the mail for me. Well, not for me, but for my kids. They say, Merry Christmas. Be sure the kids get these on that very special day. I don't want to open them, but I'm afraid what might happen if I don't. All I know is the boxes smell like glue. Very strong, industrial glue. Ikidomari. Part 1. I hear voices. They're all around me. I wish I could go back in time and tell myself to never play that damn game. They say I'm crazy, and maybe I am. Maybe whatever it is that haunts me took my sanity and hid it away. Somewhere where it's possible to find it. Somewhere dark and sinister. Maybe they buried it deep down into the core of the earth, and it's just sitting down there waiting to be found. I sound crazy, don't I? You think I'm crazy, and it's okay because I think I am as well. I'm going to share this story, and I'm going to share it as much as possible. I don't care if you believe me. All I ask from you is read the story and don't make the same mistake I made. I'm sure you've heard of true hauntings, such as the haunting of Connecticut and Amityville, and maybe you've seen the movie The Conjuring that was based on true events. You've never heard of this one. Those hauntings cannot compare to what I've witnessed. Nothing can. It was in 2005 when I came across some old abandoned apartment building. I had just finished my first semester of my senior year of college and was walking alone to my dorm from the bar. I was always alone. I didn't have many friends other than Jake and his brother Joel, my roommates, but they were always busy doing something else with their girlfriends, and I was always alone, hoping that a bottle of whiskey would solve my problems. When I came across the old building, I heard this creepy and demonic melody playing from inside. It sounded like a music box, and it was echoing somehow. I had this strange urge to go inside and find out where it was coming from. I threw my bottle of whiskey, and it broke against the curb. I walked inside the abandoned building, something I would never do if I was sober. My footsteps echoed throughout the building as I walked the halls. Most of the windows were boarded and dust filled the air, clinging onto every object that existed. I could actually taste the dust as it broke into my mouth and into my throat, causing me to cough. I moved at a leisurely pace. Dust spiraled up into clouds as I wandered the halls, searching for wherever the music was coming from. I know it sounds stupid, but I was being drawn to the sound. It had some weird effect on me. I walked into a room, and the music had stopped. The room was just like the rest of the building, old, dusty, and dark. I used the light from my cell phone to examine the old paintings that hung on the walls. I noticed how weird it was that most of the rooms had furniture left in it. It looked as if whoever were living there just got up and left, leaving behind everything. As I searched the room, I had this overwhelming sense that somebody or something was watching me. I felt like if I were to turn around, something would be there. I turned around, but I didn't see anything, but I still had a sense that something was there. Something was watching me. Then I heard the creepy melody echo from beneath the floor, and I had to find out where it was coming from. I don't know why, it just seemed like I was being forced to the sound, like I had no choice in the matter. The melody was coming from underneath a dusty rug. I pulled up the rug, dust scattered in the air like a dust storm. I felt the floor lightly shaking, and it made a sound similar to a heartbeat. It sounds crazy, but it was almost as if the floor had a pulse. There was a door on the floor that opened up, leading to some storage area. It was a deep hole, around 12 feet, which is why there was a ladder made from rope. I climbed down the rope, another thing I wouldn't do if I was sober. There wasn't much in there, just some old books, a box, and a creepy ventriloquist doll with long black hair and big round dark eyes. I noticed the strange melody was coming from the box. I picked up the box and started to climb the rope. I couldn't help but fear that something would grab me and pull me back down. I made it back up and I placed the game on the floor, shining light over it with my phone. It looked like a briefcase, but it was made of what seemed like black stone with some strange word, Ikidomari, carved into the center. I brushed the dust off with my hand and I opened it. I noticed it wasn't a box or a briefcase, it was a board game. The structure of the board game was similar to the game of life, but it had a cemetery theme, and in the center of the board, it had what appeared to be a human heart inside a glass dome. I'd never seen anything like that before. It had 6 game pieces that took on the shape of tombstones and were made of real stone. On the right side, it had a deck of red cards, and on the left were black cards. I noticed there was small writing carved on the inside of the game. If you dare to play, beware of demons. I figured it was all just for scare, and so I did something I wish I hadn't done. I was just curious, lonely, drunk, and curious. There was a wheel at the bottom right corner of the game that had numbers ranging from 0 to 9, and the objective was to spin the wheel and move your game piece to the amount of whatever number you spun. I placed the game piece to the starting point, and I spun the wheel. I watched as it spun around and around until eventually it stopped at 4. I was going to move my piece up 4 spots when suddenly it began to move on its own. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it stopped. I froze in fear for a few seconds. Normal people would have probably ran off by then, but for some strange reason, I just kept on playing, assuming there was a logical explanation for it. I've always been that way. I've always lived by what my father told me. Believe in nothing you hear and only half of what you see. Apparently, when I spun at 4, I landed on a black space. According to the game, black spaces meant you had to draw a black card. Black cards were more like tips or secrets. They weren't always bad. I picked up a black card from the deck. The words were in Japanese, but at the bottom of the cards, in smaller letters, they were translated into English. I looked at the card and read it aloud. Keep an eye on the doll. I looked over at the hole in the floor and I stood to my feet. I slowly walked toward it, lightly shaking. My teeth were grinding against each other as I got closer. I leaned over the hole and I felt my heart knocked on my chest, begging to come out. There was no doll. She was just gone. I quickly left the building and ran to my dorm room, which was just 5 minutes away. My roommates were all there with their girlfriends, sitting on the couch when I burst through the door, suffocating in sweat and fear. I told them about what had happened without leaving out a single detail. They didn't believe me, of course. I'm not really sure if I expected them to, but I sure did hope they would. They called me crazy, said I had way too much to drink, and they helped me to bed. I hope they were right. I'd rather be crazy than to know that what had just happened was real. Almost a week went by, and I'd forgotten all about it. I figured maybe it was nothing after all, and I made a bigger deal out of it than I needed to. I stopped drinking, believing that it would never cure my loneliness. It was almost a whole entire week since the incident, and I thought I wouldn't have to worry about ever going back to that old building. I thought that my troubles were over, but I found out that they weren't even close to over. They were only just beginning. Something strange happened to me. Something only explainable in a Twilight Zone episode or a Stephen King book. I was in school, as usual, walking down the hall to my class. It was strange because I was the only one in the halls, and the lights were dim and flickering. I heard a whisper as it echoed from behind me. Ikidomari. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I had no idea what was going on or why it was happening until I heard the music. It was that same haunting melody, and it echoed through the halls. I started walking faster, scampering down the hall, but it seemed like I was just walking in circles. Everywhere I went, no matter how fast I walked, I was going nowhere. I kept walking until I saw somebody or something at the end of the hall. I couldn't really see who it was because I was too far away, but it looked like a woman. She was in a white dress, and her head was tilted at an unusual angle. Ikidomari, she said more than once in a very unsettling tone that echoed through the halls. She had a Japanese accent, and I thought I was dreaming, but I was very much awake. She continued to whisper, Come back, Gordon. We're waiting for you. I felt like I was stuck in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. She kept talking to me. I had no idea how she knew my name. Gordon. I see you, Gordon. Come back. The most creepy part about her voice was the somewhat happy tone in the way it echoed. I turned to my left and noticed I found my classroom. I walked inside. Everybody was looking at me like I was crazy. I guess they saw the fear in my eyes. I looked out into the halls, and everything was normal, as if nothing ever happened. My teacher scolded me for being late, and I took my seat. I was clearly the only one who was experiencing that nightmare, so I didn't want to bring it up because I know that meant everyone else would say I'm crazy, and that I'm losing my damn mind. They wouldn't have been wrong anyway. I waited until I got back to the dorm room to bring it up with my roommates. They again thought I was crazy. I was no help at all. I've heard the haunting melody every night while in bed and every morning while in school. Something was haunting me, and I know that this sounds crazy, but it was the board game. I didn't know if I was cursed, possessed, or what, but it was haunting me, and it was driving me to the brink of losing my sanity. It was nothing but that melody for the whole entire week, until one day something strange happened. I was alone in my dorm room. The other guys were out on dates like every Friday night. I heard the melody as it squeezed through the cracking of my window. It echoed off the trees and right down to my soul. I then heard a knock at the door, and it startled me because it was a knock that I'd never heard before. Every one of my roommates had a certain knock, but that knock was more like a pound, and every time I heard it, I felt my heart pounding along with it. I slowly walked to the front door and took a deep breath before opening. My father used to tell me to count to 3 if I were ever scared, and then fight the fear with all I've got. I took another deep breath, continued knocking, and I slowly began counting. 1, 2, one more deep breath. 3. I opened the door. There was nobody in sight. I looked at the floor, and there was an envelope. I picked it up and examined it. There was no name or anything. I opened it. My heart was knocking as I pulled out a black card. Ikidomari was written on one side, and on the other, "We're waiting for you." They were haunting me, probably watching my every move for the past 2 weeks. They wanted me to finish the game, and they weren't going to stop until I did. It was as if I ran into a dead end I couldn't back out of. I kept the card in the sweaty palm of my left hand. I waited impatiently and desperately for my roommates to arrive, and they were just as annoyed as I was when they heard me talking about the melody again. I told them about the knocking. I told them about how the game was haunting me, and the only way to get it to stop was to finish what it started. I guess showing them the black card was proof enough, because I was able to get them to agree to go back to the apartment with me. They said the only reason they were doing it was to get me to shut up about it, but deep down inside, I know they were doing it because they knew that something strange was going on. We gathered some flashlights and headed out to the old apartments. Joel brought his girlfriend, Kenzie, along with us. I don't think they all knew exactly what they were getting into. I didn't even really know. The only thing I knew was that I had to finish the game, or it would probably haunt me for the rest of my pathetic life. When we arrived at the building, I had this strange feeling that something was watching us as we ambled our way inside. They followed me to the room, jokingly calling out to the ghosts that I believe resided there on the way. I was startled by the appearance of the doll sitting against the wall next to the old furnace. Her cheeks, if I weren't imagining this, were smiling at me as I walked by. The game was just where I had left it and had started playing that creepy melody when I picked it up and placed it on the table. I was surprised to find that they were hearing it along with me. That was when I knew I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't the only one. In a way, it was a huge weight taken off my shoulder. Ikidomari? What's that supposed to mean, anyway? Kenzie asked, looking at the carved writing on the board. She looked at me, expecting an answer. I had no idea what it meant, and I still don't, but it can't be anything good. We all took a seat at the table, and all eyes were pretty much on me. I flicked the wheel, and it spun, landing on a 6. We all watched my game piece, but it wasn't moving, not like it did last time. I spun again, landing on 4. Still nothing. I tried moving the piece manually, but it was stuck to the board. It was like trying to pull a nail from a wall with your bare hands. I figured there must have been a reason for this, so I read the rules that were all written at the bottom left corner of the board. I wish I had read them before I played. The rules were very horrifying, and they pretty much went like this. Welcome to the game of Ikidomari. For your safety, it is highly recommended that you read the rules before you play the game. If you place a game piece on the board and you spin the wheel, there is no going back. You hit a dead end and there's no way around it but to finish the game. The game will not end until there's one person left alive. Otherwise, it can never end. Note: this game is designed for more than one player, so if you are alone, do not start the game. Consequences will be dire. Note: the game pieces tend to move on their own, so there is no need to move them manually. Not that you could anyway. Warning: to whomever dares to play the game, be aware that there can only be one winner, and that winner shall win the ultimate prize that sits in the center of the board. To those who fail along the way, rest in peace. Warning: cheating is not tolerated and will result in dire consequences and an automatic ejection. When I found out that the game meant everything that was said, the rules made it seem like this game was a death wish. I still, to this day, wish I had read the rules first. I wouldn't be here right now, surrounded by demons if I had. Everyone else, I guess, thought it was just a game. They had no idea how real the situation was. Since I apparently already took my turn, Jake volunteered to go next. He placed a game piece at the starting point and spun the wheel. He rolled a 7, and his piece slowly moved up 7 places, landing on a light shade of gray, which, by the way, meant you didn't have to draw a card. Joel went next, and he spun a 5, landing on a gray spot. Finally, it was Kenzie's turn. She placed her tombstone on the board and spun the wheel. 4. I knew instantly that would be a black spot because I'd spun that the first time. Her piece moved up 4 spaces, and she drew a black card from the deck. I took a deep breath, probably more scared than she was. When I saw her reaction, I saw the fear crawl within her. "Look out behind you," she read out loud. We all took our flashlights and pointed them behind her. "What the hell is that thing?" Joel asked, not really expecting an answer. "Wasn't that thing over there?" Jake asked, looking at me, pointing to the furnace. "It was the doll." She somehow moved from the furnace to the rocking chair that sat behind Kenzie, without anyone noticing. She was just sitting there, the chair rocking lightly back and forth. At that point, I'm sure everyone realized how serious and real the situation was. I heard their heartbeats echo throughout the room. They were just as scared as I was. I agreed to switch seats with Kenzie, who, of course, wasn't very comfortable, with the creepy doll sitting on a rocking chair behind her. Not that that was uncomfortable with it either. We got back to the game, trying to ignore the creaking of the rocking chair. It was my turn. I spun the wheel and landed on 7. My piece moved slowly. I counted the spaces before it could stop. It landed on gray. Jake was next. He spun the wheel and landed on 5. His piece slowly moved and stopped directly in front of mine. "Shit," he muttered. He landed on a black spot, so he pulled out a black card out of the deck and read it aloud. "It's okay to be afraid, because you should be." We were indeed afraid, and yet we were just getting started. The worst had yet to come. I took a deep breath, hoping nothing would viciously pop out at us. It was Joel's turn, so he spun the wheel and landed on 4. A gray space. Kenzie spun the wheel and landed on 0. Her piece did not move, and it stayed put on a black spot. According to the rules, that would still result in drawing a black card. She pulled a card from the deck, took a deep breath, and read it aloud. "She's under the floor." We were all silent, and we listened as a voice echoed through. "It's dark down here." The voice was echoing from beneath the floor. "I can't sleep, Gordon." They all looked at me as if I knew what was going on. This woman, or thing, was haunting me. We heard a knock from under the floor, right beneath us. The air was so cold, and we actually felt a presence run through us. It was a horrifying experience, but we knew we had to continue the game. It was my turn, and I quickly spun the wheel, and thankfully, my tombstone moved to a gray space. It was Jake's turn next. He spun the wheel, landing on a 9. His game piece moved up 9 spaces, and it stopped on red. We hadn't had a red space, so we had no idea what would happen next. All that we knew was that the red cards were considered dead ends and were unpredictable and possibly dangerous. We didn't know at the time how deadly they'd be. Jake took a red card from the deck. We all took a deep breath as he began to read it. "A knock will rumble the room. Open the door or be doomed." We all looked at each other, our faces frozen in fear. Then came the knock. It was loud, more like a pound, similar to the knocking that took place earlier that day in our dorm. It did rumble the room, and it echoed right through us, our hearts becoming vulnerable and frail. "Open the door or be doomed," I said, looking at Jake. "I'm sorry, man, but you have to open the door." He looked up at me, and I saw the fear leaking from his eyes. His face was pale as he took a deep breath and stood up. We watched as he slowly walked to the door. I realized nobody had shut the door yet. Somehow it was closed without anyone noticing. I had an overwhelming sense that something bad was about to happen. The room rumbled again as there was another loud knock. Jake finally reached the door after what seemed like an eternity, and he looked back at us. The longer he took, the more frightening the situation seemed. I couldn't blame him, though. There was no telling what could have been behind that door. It could have been something demonic, something sinister. He took another deep breath as he slowly opened the door. I listened to the sound as it creaked open, and I swear everything was in slow motion. Part 2. The doll stood motionless in front of the door, waiting to be invited inside, as the light from Jake's flashlight shined upon its dusty wooden face. "It's that damn creepy doll!" he yelled, quickly walking back to the table. I really didn't understand how the doll was standing without anyone holding it up. Most or all ventriloquist dolls required someone to hold it up, but this doll stood on its feet with no problem. Maybe somebody was holding it up, someone or something we couldn't see. I believed the doll was alive somehow. Either that or someone or something was moving it from place to place without any of us noticing. Joel was up next, so he spun the wheel. His game piece moved 5 pieces to another gray space. Kenzie spun the wheel, and her game piece also moved to a gray space. It was then my turn, so I spun the wheel. We just wanted to get the game over with, so we were getting through quickly. We barely even talked to each other. I spun an 8, and my game piece moved slowly until it stopped on a red space. I looked around at everyone. They all looked frightened, except for Joel, who I guess still had the mentality that it was all just a game. I pulled a red card from the deck and took a deep breath before reading it. Don't be scared. We've just begun. The doors are now locked and there's nowhere to run. Creepy riddles. The fact that they rhymed was very, very unsettling to me. We all looked at each other, stuck in fear for what seemed like an eternity. We heard footsteps echoing through the halls. It sounded as if someone were running relentlessly around the building. What the hell's going on? Jake asked, looking at me. Everyone looked at me as if I knew the answer. I had no idea what was going on. The only thing I knew was that we were in deep trouble. Jake suddenly got up and scampered outside the room and down the hall. We all followed him out. I tried to convince him that we couldn't leave the game until it was finished. It was frightening to find out that even if we wanted to leave, there was no way we could. The doors were locked and the windows were boarded. We were stuck. There was no way out. The only way was to finish the game. While Jake and Joel furiously wandered the building in search of a way out, I was right behind them, trying to get them to understand that we had to finish the game or we'd never get out. Things were starting to get out of control. Jake and Joel were arguing, and it got to the point where I had to yell for them to shut the hell up. We have to finish the damn game, I explained. That damn game is cursed and there's no way I'm playing it, Jake said. They were finally understanding how serious and real the game was. The melody started echoing through the halls. It was calling for us. It took me a while to get everyone to understand that if we do not finish the game, we'd die either way. It was a frightening situation we were in, but finishing the game was the only way out. We all walked back to the room and back to the game. I noticed the doll sitting back in a rocking chair. I don't think anyone else noticed. We took our seats, didn't say anything at all, as we finally continued the game. One thing about this game is that it can literally drive you to go insane. That was happening to all of us. Since I drew the red card, that locked the doors. It was Jake's turn. He spun the wheel and landed on a gray spot. Joel was next, and he spun the wheel. His game piece moved 5 pieces, landing on black. He drew a black card from the deck, and it read, "Don't be afraid, but there's someone on the furnace." The only thing I liked about the black cards was they didn't rhyme. We flashed our flashlights at the furnace that sat at the other end of the room, and what we saw will give you nightmares even if you aren't asleep. Her face was insidious. She was just sitting there on the furnace, tapping it with her fingers. Her eyes were dark. You couldn't see anything inside them but evil. Her skin was pale and rotten. You could actually smell her. There was blood lightly dripping from her mouth, and it seemed as if her jaw was broken, because it hung unnaturally low as her neck tilted to an angle that no neck should ever be, unless it was broken. She had a rope hanging from her neck and she wore a white gown. I swear she was looking at me. I couldn't really tell because her eyes were dark, but I know she was looking at me. She still does. Every time I close my eyes, I see her. Her dreadful face and vile smell. Oh, probably haunt me the rest of my life. We continued the game, trying to ignore the smell, the tapping on the furnace, and the fact that something sinister was just behind us. Kenzie was next, and she spun the wheel, ending up on a gray space. I was next, and also ended up on gray. Jake spun the wheel, and we watched restlessly as it stopped on red. We were so worried about what would happen next that we didn't notice the tapping and smell was no longer lingering, and that whatever that thing was no longer there. Jake took a red card from the deck, and I could tell how scared he was by the emptiness in his eyes and how slow he was moving. We were all scared about what would happen next. She sits in the dark and feeds on fear. Don't be afraid, or she'll appear. Everything was silent. You could have heard the sound of our hearts beating against our chests if you were there. They were beating and begging for the fear to go away, and no matter how many times I counted to 3, the fear was like a never-ending curse upon us. Our flashlights started flickering until they went out completely. The room was black, and I was convinced that we were already dead and in hell. We heard the sound of heavy breathing, and it most definitely wasn't any of us. It was something more demonic and haunting. We heard the tapping against the furnace, and the music started playing from the game, the creepy melody that echoed through the room. We felt a pulse, and that pulse was coming from the heart that sat ghastly at the center of the board game. After a minute, everything became silent again, but it was still completely dark. We sat in silence for about 15 seconds before the hopeless screaming of Jake echoed throughout the room and out into the hall. The door slammed shut, and we were stuck helpless in the room, listening to the screaming of Jake as it faded out into the halls. Something dragged him away. Joel pounded on the door as he yelled for his brother, but there was nothing else we could do but continue the game. I tried to convince both Joel and Kenzie that Jake was probably fine, even though I knew very well that he wasn't. I just wanted to finish the game. We sat back down, saddened by the empty seat at the table. I didn't know if anyone else was seeing what I was seeing, because they said nothing about it, but I saw that thing again, that woman sitting on the furnace, tapping away. I ignored her, and we continued the game, still traumatized by what had just happened. To make matters even worse, Jake's game piece, his tombstone, moved suddenly to the bottom right of the board, where other tombstones resided. He was officially out of the game. Joel was next. He spun the wheel and barely missed the red one by 1 space. Kenzie spun, and her tombstone stopped on gray. I then spun the wheel, and my tombstone moved 6 spaces to black. Black cards no longer scared me compared to the haunting red ones. They were harmless. I took a card from the deck, and it read, my voice becoming frail, "She's watching you." I flashed my flashlight around the room, not really sure what I was going to see. I saw the doll sitting against the wall of the bedroom door. She was looking right at me. Her evil stare pierced into my mind as a memory. I ignored her, turned back to the game, and we continued. Joel was next. He spun the wheel and landed on 6. We watched as his tombstone stopped at a red space. He took his time before drawing a red card from the deck. "They're calling from the graveyard gates. You've disturbed the dead. Lock the doors and stay away. There's something you will dread." We looked around at each other, confused and worried. We heard the footsteps and moaning echoing from the halls. The smell of their rotten skin could be smelled from miles away. They were coming toward us, their footsteps and moaning getting louder as they got closer. The door was opening when Joel and I slammed it shut just before they were coming in. We moved the refrigerator over to the door to keep them from breaking through, and it worked out well. They were moaning, growling, and hungry for flesh. There had to be at least 10 of them. I wasn't exactly sure what they were, but they were clearly something possessed, and something dead. After a while, the moaning and pounding at the door had stopped, and I guess whatever those things were, they were just entering the graveyard and laying back into their dreadful graves. Kenzie spun the wheel after everything had calmed down, and we were finally able to breathe. Her game piece moved to a gray space. I spun the wheel afterward, meaning a gray space as well. Joel was next, and he spun the wheel, just missing red by one space. Kenzie spun the wheel, and her tombstone moved 8 spaces and stopped just in front of Joel's. She landed on red. We looked at each other, the dead silence adding to the suspense as she took a red card from the deck. She read it slowly. Her hands were noticeably shaking as she held the card in her hand. She waits behind the bedroom door. Under the sheets, she walks the floor. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Joel asked, as if anyone actually knew the answer. The bedroom door creaked open, shining my flashlight. I saw a hand reach out of the door, and it made a gesture that was basically saying, "Come here." What happened next, I really didn't understand. It was as if Kenzie was possessed or something, because she got out of her chair and slowly walked over toward the door. I saw the emptiness in her eyes. It was like she had no soul, like she was a walking corpse. "What the hell are you doing, Kenzie?" Joel asked, worriedly. "Get the hell back here, Mackenzie!" He stood from his chair and tried to stop her, but it was too late. She was pulled inside and the door slammed shut. It was silent, other than the sound of Joel pounding on the door. We couldn't hear a sound coming from the room. We managed to get the door open a few minutes later. We were hearing a creaking sound, and that sound was coming from a rope that was wrapped around Kenzie's neck and hung from the ceiling. She rocked slowly back and forth, and her jaw hung low, in an unnatural position as if it was broken. Joel pulled her down and tried to revive her, but there was nothing. Not even a trained doctor could do. She was dead. He was oblivious to the breathing sound that echoed through the room. There was something in there with us. Something sinister. The room wasn't completely dark. We were able to see without our flashlights due to the moon that shined vividly outside the window. It wasn't boarded. We couldn't see anyone, but we heard it, breathing. The smell was unbearable, and it wasn't coming from Kenzie's corpse. It was coming from the thing that suddenly walked out of the closet and sat at the side of the bed. Joel and I just stood there in fear as she turned her head toward us, our minds traumatized by her deadly dark eyes. She was tapping against the nightstand next to the bed, and she had some dusty sheets that were once white wrapped around her shoulders. I realized that it was that same woman or thing that sat on the furnace. She just stared at us. The room was silent in the most horrifying way. The only thing we could hear was her heavy breathing. "Shh," she whispered, her fingers pressed to her lips. I love this song. The music from the game was playing. She got out of the bed and danced around the room. The terrible smell followed behind her. Her voice was probably the most creepy part of it all. It was her creepy tone and the way it echoed. I turned over to Joel, trying to understand why he hadn't left the room yet. "Let's get the hell out of here, Joel," I said. He stood up off the floor and looked at me. "My brother's out there somewhere," he said, wiping the tears from his eyes. "I have to find him." He seemed unfazed by the creepy dancing woman in the room. He scampered out of the room, and I helped him move the refrigerator from the door before we walked out into the hall. "Jake!" His screaming echoed through the halls, probably waking anything that lived within him. We searched through some of the rooms for about 20 minutes before that creepy melody from the game started playing again. I knew it was just a matter of time. He thought it was a good idea that we split up, and that's what we did. He searched the 4th floor while I searched the 3rd. I was searching through a room when my flashlight started flickering before it turned off. I heard footsteps, first believing that they were mine, until I stood still and the footsteps continued. It was dark, the windows were boarded, blocking out any light from outside. Somebody else was in there with me, and I know it wasn't Joel, because I heard his calls for his brother echoing through the hall. The door slammed shut, and I felt a cool breeze run through me. "Jake," I whispered. "You in here?" Everything was silent. The only thing I heard was Joel yelling. Then I heard a voice, but it wasn't very clear. "He's dead." It was a deep, dark, and sinister tone. I couldn't see anything or anybody, but I felt them. I felt their presence. I was lightly tapping my flashlight, trying to get it to work. I closed my eyes and I started counting to 3. I was slightly shaking, and every part of me, it seemed, had a pulse. 1, 2. I took a deep breath. 3. The flashlight finally turned on, and it flashed directly at some old dusty mirror. I saw her standing behind me. I felt her cold breath as it dissolved into my skin. I ran out of the room, literally as fast as I could. I was surprised my heart didn't jump out of my chest, because it sure did feel like it would. I walked back down to the first floor of the game. When I stepped into the room, I noticed someone standing over by the window. It was Joel. He was just standing there in a fixed position, completely immobile. "Joel?" I walked toward him slowly. "You okay, man?" He turned around slowly. His face was so pale, and he had bags under his eyes as if he hadn't slept in days. I wondered if I looked like that. "Did you find anything?" he asked, finally dropping back to earth. I thought about the devilish woman I saw. "No, sorry." He sat back down at the table. I had a feeling that he didn't care what happened next. Like he didn't care to die. He didn't seem scared or worried. He was just, I don't know. 2 seats were now empty as we continued the game. Kenzie's tombstone, I noticed, had moved to the bottom right of the board next to Jake's. I spun the wheel and landed on 2. That kept me on gray. Joel spun the wheel and was forced to draw a black card. He took a card from the deck and it read, "She's watching you." He wiped the tears from his eyes with his shirt and looked over at the bedroom door where Kenzie's body lay still. "It's her," he said, crying. "It's Mackenzie." I turned around, but I didn't see her. Either he was losing his mind or she was actually there. I wouldn't be surprised if she was. I spun the wheel and landed on the same space as Joel. That meant I had to draw a black card. I took a card from the deck and read it. "There's somebody at the door." A loud knock echoed through the room as Joel and I froze in fear. Joel and I stayed put as the knocking continued until the door suddenly creaked open. We heard the footsteps, but we didn't see anybody. Joel spun the wheel, desperate to end the game. He was safe from the black and red cards as his tombstone stopped on gray. I spun the wheel, also safe from the cards. As Joel spun the next wheel, I saw Jake. He was sitting on the furnace, tapping away. His jaw hung low as if it was broken, and his eyes were dark, but I knew he was looking at me. Joel had his back turned so he couldn't see him, and I guess he couldn't hear the tapping. He was completely oblivious to Jake's presence. I pretended like I didn't see anything, and eventually the tapping stopped and he disappeared. Joel and I continued to land on gray until eventually Joel was forced to draw a red card. "This is it, isn't it?" he said to me, his voice becoming weak. I didn't say anything. I wasn't really sure what to say. He took a deep breath and read the card. "Under the floor you must peek. There's something there beneath your feet." I remembered the hole in the floor where I first found the board game. I showed Joel to the door and he lifted it up. We flashed our flashlights inside to see what was under. What we saw can unfortunately never be unseen. Joel immediately looked away in distraught when he saw what was down there. It was Jake. His corpse was already being infested with flies and maggots as it lay down there against the wall. There was no blood, but it was clear that his neck was snapped and his jaw was broken, because they were each in unnatural positions. Joel just stood there, his back turned from the ditch. He wasn't crying or showing any kind of emotion. He just looked empty and exhausted. I sensed that something was going to happen, and it did. Something down there grabbed Joel by his ankle and tried to pull him down. I tried to help him, but there was nothing I could do. The game wanted him, and they got him. They pulled him under, and the door slammed shut. I was all alone. The melody started playing from the game, and I walked over to it, not knowing what to do next. My game piece started moving to the center of the board, and it stopped directly at the heart. The heart started beating. It had a pulse. The music got louder and louder. It was piercing through my head until suddenly it stopped. My game piece moved all the way back to the beginning where I first started. That was it. The game was over. I left the building without ever looking back. I didn't want to go back to my dorm room where I would be alone, so I walked to the grocery store that was just a couple minutes away, and I cried to everyone there that my friends were all dead. I know they all thought I was crazy, but they called the police, and the bodies of my friends were found later that night. I told them the story. I told them everything that had happened, but they never believed me. The game was never found, but I know it was somewhere in that building. Somewhere either within the walls or under the floors, haunted by the demons within. I can hear the melody playing right now as I sit alone in my room, surrounded by white walls and cameras. They're watching me. I can hear them. I can feel them, and I can see them. That game is somewhere in this world, and I pity the poor soul who finds it. I learned to live with the haunting melody that echoes wherever I go. I sometimes put on my dancing slippers and I dance to the melody. I dance around and around and around. I dance to the sound of fear because it's the only sound I hear. The Legend of Shuffling Joe. Part 1. It was a typical day at school when I heard that Jessica Bramer had disappeared. That's not to say that there was anything especially typical about Jessica herself. She'd been one of the most beautiful girls in school. She'd been in virtually every organization. Her grades were good. She even played the flute. Not that many people really liked her. She, like many other students, was exceedingly popular, but not especially well liked. She was the kind that would smile softly while asking you to buy some pies for the prom committee, but then rebuff you in the hallway when you said hello. You know the kind. It was still shocking, though, when she went missing. Everyone felt bad, especially for her boyfriend, Jake. They'd been dating for several months, and it was, after all, really sad that a girl from Addison High should go missing like that. It was whispered about, speculated about, talked to death. Then school let out for the summer. Nothing was really said about Jessica when school started again. Of course, come autumn, someone started a rumor that Jessica's ghost had been seen out by Jefferson Creek on the old South Road. No one was terribly surprised by this, mind you. It was a creepy stretch of highway that runs by the abandoned Carver place. If a person's ghost was going to be seen anywhere, that would be the place. The rumor created an interesting little buzz in the school just in time for Halloween. Most people poked fun at the rumor because they didn't want to seem uptight or overly serious. I mean, the whole thing was over 6 months old. It was basically old news. There'd been no leads, there'd be no body. The case was dead, and so, probably, was Jessica. How or why was anyone's guess. Besides, it wasn't as if anyone was terribly torn up about her disappearance. Well, except Jake, that is. I guess you could say the cheerleading squad was pretty sad too, actually. But only because she'd taken so many years of gymnastics and could do some really cool stunts. The weeks went by and the whole story about Jefferson Creek reached fever pitch. It was mid-autumn, so naturally everyone wanted to go out to the Old South Road after dark and try to get a glimpse of her disembodied spirit. It wasn't that different from the kids who played Ghost in the Graveyard out in West Lawn Cemetery. It was kind of disrespectful, but basically harmless. Besides, we all find it kind of intriguing, especially my friend Lena. Lena was something of a goth girl. She didn't exactly practice witchcraft, but she was fascinated by it. She claimed that she knew how to perform spells and that she had the ability to talk to the dead, but I wasn't entirely convinced she had any special ability in either discipline. Personally, I suspected that she'd adopted the whole gothic persona just to be different. I'd seen her in action enough times to know that she was one of those people who'd argue with you just so she wouldn't appear ordinary. You know the kind. They're always pointing out your shortcomings in that slightly condescending way. It didn't surprise me at all when she said that I was a dead battery when it came to the spirit world, as if she knew the difference. However, when she suggested that we drive out to Jefferson Creek for a Jessica Bramer seance, I decided to go along, but just for kicks. The idea sounded pretty weird, but it was getting close to Halloween, and I thought it might be interesting. Besides, the idea of doing something adventurous that would appall my overly religious mother was strangely appealing to me. I'm not even sure why. Word about the seance got around the school almost immediately. People I didn't even know were coming up to me and either asking to come along or telling me how repulsed and disgusted they were. In truth, I wasn't even sure how I felt about the whole business myself. I mean, it all sounded great when you're sitting in the school cafeteria, eating cheese sticks and slugging soda, telling everyone about it. It's another thing entirely to be out by the edge of the creek in the moonlight, with the smell of dry leaves wafting on the breeze and the sound of water rolling nearby. Let me be perfectly clear. Jefferson Creek is one of the creepiest places in the state. It's literally out in the middle of nowhere. There are actually stories about people disappearing from the old highway. Many of these unfortunate people have shown up floating downstream near Hoopstown, nearly 40 miles away. My mom insists I use an alternate route home when I have to come that way. She always tells me the story of Becky Gilman, a 19-year-old girl from Milton County who was horribly murdered out on the Old South Road, a few miles from Jefferson Creek. The body was so terribly mangled that dental records were required to identify her. Even seasoned police officers were unsettled by the horror. All of these things were floating around in my mind as I sat in the back seat of Lena's car headed for Jefferson Creek. It was late October, and it was quite cool, nearly 45 degrees. It was also very dark. The moon was a mere slit in the night sky. There were, however, a multitude of stars. It had been a clear day, and it promised to be a crisp night. We turned off the interstate and drove along a frontage road toward the old highway. This country road was like many. It was covered with white-gray patches of pavement, crisscrossed by gravel-filled cracks and weeds. There were also plenty of potholes thrown in for good measure. There was an open field edged with thick trees on our right, and the ever-drifting interstate lights moving away at an angle on the left. Eventually, we turned onto the far end of the Old South Road, which was lined closely with trees. Lena's headlights pierced the darkness that seemed to be closing in on both sides. I found myself jumping a bit whenever we hit a pothole. It was just so incredibly dark out there in the trees, and we're getting so far away from the glow of civilization. The houses became further and further apart, and streetlights disappeared almost completely for miles at a time. The thickness of trees on both sides of the road prevented a person from seeing too far ahead, and the light from a barn or doorstep, set far up a gravel lane, actually glimmered with a halo of cool menace. It seemed like we drove for nearly an hour. How did Lena know the way? Was she taking the scenic route? I was about to ask her when she spoke. "It's supposed to be right around the corner," she said, leaning over the steering wheel, trying to peer into the thick darkness. "We've got to be getting close to the turn." "Have you ever been out here before?" I asked, afraid to know the answer. "No, but my sister was once. She's the one who gave me the directions. It's really not that hard to get to." She paused and then added, "She said people used to come out here all the time." We hit another pothole, and I could hear the rattle of the candles and the flashlights we'd brought along for the adventure rolling around in the trunk. "Why?" I asked. I couldn't imagine anyone going out of their way there just for kicks. "Well, lots of reasons," she replied vaguely, "but most people came to see if the legend was true." "Legend? What legend?" I queried, intrigued. "I hope you don't mean that old Becky Gilman story," Sandy, my other friend from civics class, added, unimpressed. She'd come along because, like Lena, she was really into fortune-telling, ghosts, and the supernatural. The whole idea of a seance fascinated her. "No, the original story," Lena answered. "The one that explains why the place is haunted. It's kind of cool." "I didn't know the creek was haunted," I commented. "Me neither," said Sandy. "Since when does Jefferson Creek have a ghost?" "Since forever," Lena answered, somewhat sarcastically. She had a way of making every one of your questions sound completely ridiculous. "Okay, so what's the story?" I asked. "Probably just some headless guy that wanders around the place," Sandy teased. "No, he's not headless," Lena replied somewhat jokingly. "He's just some guy who used to live around here a long time ago. It's a really old story, I guess. My sister said she heard it from her friend's old neighbor lady. The old woman was like 100 years old or something. Only the older people in the area really know the story anymore. Even my mom doesn't know very much about it, and she's lived here all her life." "So what's the story?" Sandy pressed, impatient to hear about the ghost. "Well, supposedly there was a strange guy who used to live out in the woods by himself. Everybody called him Shuffling Joe because he walked with a limp. His foot had some problem, so he always leaned to one side when he walked. Anyway, one night a couple was driving home from someplace. It was dark, and the husband couldn't see very well. Some people say he was drunk, but I don't know either way. All I know is something came out of the woods as he was about to drive over the bridge, and he hit it in the dark. At first, the guy wasn't sure what he'd hit, so he pulled over, jumped out of the car, and began searching around. Eventually, he stumbled on the body of a man. Some say it was Joe. Of course, the guy freaked. He didn't want to go to jail, so he pushed the body down the embankment into the creek where it floated downstream. Then he jumped back in the car and told his wife they hit a deer. Soon after, he drove away into the night. After that, he was never the same. He was always tense, looking over his shoulder. He wouldn't look into mirrors, and he never drove again. In less than a month, he was dead. Supposedly, he went totally insane and jumped off a bridge. Now, legend has it that anyone who approaches the Jefferson Creek Bridge by night will have some sort of car trouble. The lights will suddenly go off, or the engine will just die. Sometimes both. Lena's voice grew softer. Then, while you're working on your car, or just sitting there, you'll hear the sound of someone walking toward the car. It's always someone with a limp. You think it's help, but it isn't. It's Shuffling Joe, come to take his revenge on the people who had left him to die. So, what does he do? I asked, somewhat freaked out but still curious. He comes for blood. Lena purred, enjoying our discomfort. People say he slits your throat from ear to ear. Oh, my God, I whispered. That's disgusting. But I haven't told you the best part. She paused for effect, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer and more sinister than usual. It's said that he always breaks his victims' legs before he kills them, so that everyone who passes through here will know what it's like to be a cripple. She ended with a wicked-sounding snicker. Wow, that's quite a story. I'm not sure I'd share it with people as you're driving them out to Jefferson Creek, though. Sandy commented snidely, clearly somewhat annoyed. Yeah, I added, like we're not freaked out enough already. It's not even that bad. You guys just need to relax. Lena chuckled, not taking us seriously. Don't get me wrong. I think the story's cool and all, Sandy amended. I'm just saying your timing kind of sucks. Whatever. Lena smirked. I'm with this Sandy on this one, Lena, I added. You probably should have saved that story. I don't know why you guys are so freaked out. It's just a story. Lena sighed, exasperated with us. It's not like it's real or anything. It doesn't have to be. It's the fact that we're out here in the middle of nowhere and you're talking about cripples who slit people's throats, Sandy pointed out. Yeah, and it's not like weird stuff hasn't happened out here, I commented. People have disappeared up by the creek, Lena. You could say that about any wooded area, Lena argued. My mom used to tell me to stay off Hicks Road after dark, too, because some girl was murdered out behind the old armory back in the 60s. I'd hardly put Hicks Road in the same category with this one, would you? Sandy argued. I mean, let's get real. The Old South Road has a reputation. Hicks Road doesn't. One murder doesn't give a road a reputation. Yeah, I added, and let's not forget why we're here right now. One of our classmates supposedly went missing out this way. That's just a rumor, Lena replied. Logan Gallagher started that business a few weeks ago. Nobody actually knows where Jessica was when she disappeared. Sandy sunk down into the back seat, her head at a strange angle. I thought at first that she was pouting, but I soon realized that she was thinking. She spoke again after a long pause. I probably should have mentioned this before. I don't know why I didn't. I guess I didn't really give it too much thought until now. She paused again. That was her introduction. Did you know that I'm friends with Jessica Bramer's cousin? The question was directed at no one in particular. You mean Joe Finks? I asked. Yeah, she replied. I merely shook my head in the darkness, making a sound of denial. She continued a moment later. Well, Joe and I are pretty close. He's a good guy. He doesn't make stuff up. He told me that Jessica may have actually gone out to the creek the night she disappeared. She paused for a moment, letting this fact sink in. Then she continued. She was at Darren Hinkle's house with Joe and a bunch of other people, and they all started playing Truth or Dare. Joe said that somebody dared her to drive out to the old Carver place and go up on the porch and knock on the door. Sandy was quiet for a bit. He said he didn't know for sure if anybody actually went out there because he had to leave early, but he said there was definitely talk about going, and that was the last time he ever saw her. Sandy was sullen, almost meditative, watching her hands. Several minutes seemed to pass in silence before she spoke again. Finally, she continued. I asked some of her friends if it was true, but no one would talk about it like it was some big secret. It was just weird. An uneasy stillness fell over the car. I began to wonder if maybe all the rumors about Jessica were true. Although I didn't like her, she was a student in my school, and her disappearance was very close to me. I shivered a little, involuntarily. The lull in conversation finally ended when Lena spoke. Sounds like Jessica got exactly what was coming to her. I couldn't stand her anyway. She always looked down her nose at everybody. Her disappearance didn't break anyone's heart, except maybe the cheerleading squad's. Although we shared Lena's feelings on a certain level, they seemed harsh coming right after Sandy's story. We didn't say anything for several moments. It was our way of letting Lena know she'd gone too far. When Sandy spoke again, her tone was serious, matter of fact. It doesn't matter, Lena. I don't plan on getting out of this car tonight. I'm just telling you. Whatever, was Lena's icy reply. Then there was a long pause before her eyes turned to me in the rearview mirror. What about you? Are you getting out? There was impatience in her voice. It was clear that she was testing me. I don't know, was my answer. I'll have to see the place. If it's totally weird, I trailed off. Well, if neither of you is getting out, then there's really no point in any of this, is there? She sighed, exasperated. You know, Lena, this was your idea, Sandy shot back. And you never mentioned any of that legend crap before we agreed to come out here with you. Well, you never mentioned that stuff about Jessica playing Truth or Dare before I agreed to come out here with you, she challenged. I'm still going to go through with it. Well, I'm not you, Sandy answered evenly. You know, I thought you'd be into this kind of thing, seeing as we're all witchy and whatnot, argued Lena. I mean, you act like you're all into this fortune-telling and a Ouija board stuff. I figured you'd dig it. Lena smirked in the rearview mirror. Oh, I do dig it, Sandy replied. I just don't especially want to drive out into the middle of nowhere and wait for some psycho to slash my throat open. Sorry if that's not my thing. Like that would even happen. Lena sighed briefly before adding savagely, You know what I think? I think you don't want to do this seance thing anymore because you're not really the expert you pretend to be. I think you're really just a fake and you're terrified somebody might find out. Did you seriously just call me a fake? Sandy spat. Well, you're nothing but a hypocrite. At least I'm not all skittish about some stupid legend. You guys are a bunch of babies. We're not babies. We just happen to have a little more common sense than you do, apparently. Sandy returned. I mean, in case you hadn't noticed, we're not exactly sitting in somebody's kitchen looking at some tarot cards, Lena. We're out in the woods on a dark road where a girl we both know probably went missing. If you're not a little bothered by this, I'd say it's you who's got the problem, Sandy finished defensively. Whatever, sighed Lena, rolling her eyes sarcastically. I'm going to find some place to turn around, since I'm the only one who actually wants to do this. Oh, don't let us stop you. We'll wait in the car for you if you'd like, Sandy smiled, almost daring Lena to get out of the car alone. What, and have a seance by myself? Oh, that's brilliant, Sandy. Lena answered back. Yeah, why not? Pursued Sandy. It's not like you couldn't do it alone. And you know that because you're such an expert, right? Lena said snidely. Oh, but I'm not an expert, remember? Sandy returned. Knock it off, you two, I sighed. I hated all of the bickering. I just wanted to go home. The slit of moon was lost from view as the canopy of dead leaves grew thicker overhead. The sound of twigs snapping beneath the trees grew increasingly common as we drove along the old country road. The headlights did little to cut the darkness. We were nearing water because a filmy fog began to cling to the ghostly trunks of trees outside to our left. Misty billows skirted out ahead of the gleam of the headlights, floated before us in the night. Finally, we came up a small laneway where we could turn around. We pulled in, leaves brushing the sides of the car. We pulled in just far enough to be off the road. "You guys sure you want to go back?" she asked, barely hopeful. There was still a part of me that was curious, but it was kind of a curiosity that wanted daylight and sunshine rather than fog and darkness. "I'm sure," I answered softly, hoping my answer wouldn't upset Lena further. Sandy had no such qualms. "I want to get the heck out of here. This whole place gives me the creeps," she replied. "Okay." Lena sighed sharply, putting the car in reverse. Part 2. I felt somewhat defeated, in spite of the fact that we were heading home. I looked over at Sandy. Her face was turned toward the window opposite me, but I could still make out the square set of her jaw. I sat by Sandy all semester, but she always seemed so easygoing. That night, her quick wit and sharp retorts had surprised me somewhat, and pleased me a little as well. I hated to admit it, but I liked Sandy's ability to handle Lena. I'd always been somewhat passive, and as a result, Lena had a tendency to push me around. If Sandy had not come along, I felt sure that we'd be out on our way to the creek, whether I'd voiced any misgivings or not. We started moving backward, out onto the road again. I could hear the branches gently scraping the sides of the car as we moved. I rested my head against the window, my eyes staring into the foliage outside. As we straightened out in the road, I looked up the laneway we'd just left. Fog filled the space where our car had been. Was I imagining, or was the fog getting thicker? I made slits of my eyes as I stared down the gravel path. Was that a house in the distance? I wondered momentarily if it might be the old Carver place. How close had we gotten to Jefferson Creek? We'd never know now. We moved forward. The windshield had increasingly a whiter shade. I could hear Lena swearing a bit under her breath. I began to feel a little afraid. What if we got lost? What would we do? "Lena, do you have your cell?" I asked hesitantly. "Yeah," she replied. "It's got a full charge. Why?" "Just curious," I murmured. "Let me guess, you're totally freaked out by this fog, right?" She almost chuckled. "Don't worry." "Well, I don't know how you can even see in this." "It's not like I have to navigate or anything," she said with an ounce of condescension. "I mean, it's a straight shot once you're off the frontage road." "Okay," I answered, almost ashamed. Sandy didn't comment. I looked over at her again. Her eyes were closed. She was listening to music through her headphones, tapping her feet and humming some song. She didn't care either way. Our steady progress seemed increasingly slow. It felt as if we were moving at a snail's pace, even though we probably weren't. I only sensed our movement during the long stretches of widely spaced trees. The fog seemed to thin out in those areas, and I could make out the ebony trunks of the trees and occasionally a lonely farmhouse. Once, as we were passing through one of these open sections, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a man in the distance. He wore an old hat with a wide brim. He stood very still, watching us as we went by. I couldn't take my eyes off of his silhouette. There was something dark and sinister about his being there all alone with no farmhouse near. I was shaken deep down, but I said nothing to Lena. God forbid I should share another fear with her. I almost said something to Sandy, but she wouldn't have heard me over her headphones anyway. She was still humming softly, peering out the window near her. What was she looking at, I wondered? Just then, Sandy slowly sat up in her seat and peered out the window meaningfully. What's the matter? I asked, trying to sound calm. We're turning, she said, very matter-of-factly. We're on a curve. Can you feel it? I sat perfectly still for several moments. She kept looking at me, waiting. Can you feel it? She asked again. A little, I replied, unsure. I think we're moving in toward the fog, she whispered. Alina, we didn't take a curve coming in, did we? I asked. No. It was all a straight shot from the frontage road. There aren't any curves. So, what's happening? Sandy inquired pointedly. Why are we turning if there aren't any curves? I don't know. The cockiness gone out of Lena's voice. We could have made a wrong turn. It's all one direction. Are there any street signs? Sandy asked. None that would help us. It's not like we'd recognize anything. Lena snapped back. We were definitely turning. There was no mistaking it. The road on the left was changing. It wasn't just endless trees and bushes. It seemed that an embankment was forming far in the distance. It was moving toward us, a little at a time. Is that the creek over there? Sandy pointed, afraid, because we weren't anywhere near the water coming in. There's a little nervous trill in her voice. This is crazy. Lena looked over to her left. This is just insane. There's no way the creek can be over there. It's not possible. The creek runs east and west, and we were driving north and south. Now it's over there on our left. You just turn right off the front road, and you go straight. I went straight all the way in. I didn't turn anywhere. You're supposed to come to an intersection with a big oak tree on the left. The bridge is about 3 miles ahead of that. How can we have just shifted directions? I don't get it. She was growing more exasperated the more she spoke. I don't get it. Why don't we just stop for a second and figure this thing out? Sandy suggested. Lena continued driving for a moment before she saw the wisdom of the suggestion and stopped. We all sat there listening to the hum of the motor. We need to figure this out, Lena began. We need to figure out where we are. Are we still on Old South Road? I asked. I'm not sure anymore. Something weird's going on here, Lena remarked. This is probably a bad time to mention that I saw something out on the fog back there, huh? Said Sandy. In the trees? I asked, trying to hold my fear in check. Where was it? Forget where it was. What was it? Asked Lena, turning around to face us, her eyes wide. I don't remember where exactly, she began, looking at me. Had she seen what I'd seen? She didn't get the answer to my question because I interrupted her. I think I may have seen it too. Was it a man? Yes, with a hat on, she threw in. Just standing there watching us drive by, I continued. I wasn't sure if I actually saw him or not. I paused for a beat. But wait, I saw him over here. I stopped again, puzzled. How did you see the same man over there that I saw over here? That can't be, right? Maybe there were 2 men. Sandy interrupted, her voice somewhat shaken. Okay, you guys are freaking me out. You both need to stop it, snapped Lena. But Lena, if there's someone wandering around out here, I argued, I don't care. We need to stop now. Lena's voice grew stronger. Lena, calm down, Sandy stated, her tone firm and mildly sarcastic. Now who's freaking out? Yes, I'm freaking out, she spat. What do you expect me to do? You just told me there was some stranger wandering around out here watching us drive by. It's probably nothing, I reasoned. Yeah, you're getting yourself all worked up, Sandy interrupted. This isn't helping. You know what would help? She began, her voice thick with sarcasm. if you two would just shut up." Lena hollered the last, slamming her hand against the steering wheel for emphasis. It was then that the headlights suddenly and inexplicably went out. "Okay, Lena, not funny. So not funny," said Sandy. "Do you really think I'd be pulling a prank right now?" Lena snapped. I instinctively hit the door lock at my left. Taking my cue, Lena hit the door lock for all of the doors. I could hear our breathing. We were all terrified. I could hear the faint sound of Sandy's headphones still going, but she shut them off just as I became aware of them. "It's not me," Lena murmured. "I didn't do it. I swear." I don't know how long we sat there in kind of suspended animation. We were frozen with disbelief. The question that kept coming back to me was always the same. What were we going to do? It was Sandy who said the question out loud. "What are we going to do?" Lena cleared her throat before speaking. "First, we're going to call my dad and tell him where we are. Then we're going to shut off the car and wait until he comes for us. Deal?" Since she lived closest and no one could think of a better plan, we decided she was right. She reached into her purse and pulled out the phone. She dialed her number. She didn't need to tell me that she had no signal. I was expecting that twist. It was the irony of life. How many times did we mistakenly talk on the phone when no one cared? Now, when it was imperative that we reach someone, there was no one to be reached. There was also the problem of location. Suppose we called her dad and even reached him. What then? Where were we? Even we didn't know. How could we talk to someone to come and get us if we didn't even know our location? It was a quandary. "What now?" I asked. "I don't know. We wait till dawn?" Lena whispered hopefully. "It's like 10, Lena," began Sandy a bit sarcastically. "We can't just sit here all night. Besides, we'll have to turn off the car. We're going to need gas to get out of here." "Yeah," I began. "Maybe we should shut off the car." It was more of a statement than a question. Lena was quiet for several moments. I could tell that she was thinking again. "Okay," she began, talking her way through the problem. "The lights have gone out. Okay. I need light to drive." "There's your cell phone," I suggested. "Yeah, but it doesn't give off much light. Besides, I don't especially want to run down the battery using it that way," she answered. "Hey, wait. Why don't we just use your GPS?" I exclaimed excitedly. The thought had just occurred to me. "Yeah." Sandy sat forward suddenly, overcome with new hope. "Are you insane?" she murmured sarcastically. "We're talking about my dad, remember? He's like the cheapest guy on earth. My phone's a dinosaur. Besides, GPS doesn't do me any good if I can't see to drive," Lena reasoned. There goes that idea. Sandy sulked, sliding back into her former position. "Well, don't we have a flashlight in the trunk?" I asked, looking at Sandy. "We could use that, couldn't we? I mean, it doesn't solve the GPS problem, but it could give us some light." "I assume it has batteries?" Lena challenged, also looking at Sandy in the rearview mirror. It was Sandy's flashlight. "Yeah, it would be kind of pointless to bring it if it didn't work," she replied. Lena tried not to roll her eyes. Okay. Lena began, psyching herself up. "When did you see that person?" "A long way back up the road," I pointed. "Like 10 minutes ago, at least." "Yeah," agreed Sandy. "I saw him a while ago, too." "Okay," Lena began. "I'm going to get that flashlight out of the trunk." Sandy almost broke into dissuade her, but Lena hissed a bit and kept going. If I can get that, then we can actually see where we're going. The risks are worth the payoff. You see that, right?" We all agreed that she was right. She nodded her head with resolution before speaking again. "Now, I'm going to roll down my window about an inch. I'm going to talk to you the whole time I'm out there. If you don't hear me," she swallowed a minute, Something's wrong, okay?" "Do you want one of us to get out with you?" Sandy asked. "Yeah, I mean, one of us could hold the phone so you can see, or something," I suggested. "Which one of you wants to volunteer for that job?" Lena asked sarcastically, looking in the rearview mirror. I hoped Sandy would speak up, but she didn't. I couldn't bring myself to volunteer either. The thought of leaving the car terrified me. That's what I thought. Lena smirked before adding, "It's probably better this way anyway. If there is a problem, you'll need the phone to call for help. It needs to stay in the car. It's the only one we've got. Besides, it's not as though there's that much stuff in the trunk. I should be able to find that bag without a light." We all sat there quietly, listening to the engine rumbling in the darkness. Lena finally broke the silence by pushing a nearby button and opening the driver's side window about an inch. "If something happens, I want you to try calling my dad again. It's listed under Dad in my contacts." "And if we can't reach him?" Sandy asked, tentatively. "I guess you'll just have to call 911. Her voice was static, emotionless. It was her way. When situations become too intense, Lena divorced herself from them. I watched Lena's features alter as her fear took hold. She swallowed it down like poison. I silently cursed myself for being so cowardly, and for having such a conservative mother. "You don't need a cell phone." That was my mother's constant refrain. "What now, Mother? What now?" Then again, had I taken my mother's advice and had avoided this adventure, as she suggested, I probably wouldn't have needed a cell phone in the first place. What now, indeed? As for Sandy, her phone had broken during the second week of school. It was anyone's guess as to why she never stopped by the store to get it replaced. Now we all sat in Lena's car with one working phone. Sort of. "I'm going to count to 3 and then I'm going to run out there," said Lena, reaching down under her seat to pull the trunk release. Then she paused for several moments, gathering her nerve. Finally, she broke the dreadful silence. 1. I found myself breathing shallowly, my breath catching in my throat. My heart was pounding so hard that my chest actually hurt. 2. I could see her hand reaching for the door handle. She unlocked the door manually with her other hand. 3. She hesitated for just a moment before jumping out of the car and skittering around to the back. She made small talk while she opened the trunk and dug around inside. It was almost pitch black out there, so I knew she would have trouble finding anything. Of course, the fact that Lena took corners like an Indy 500 racer didn't help either. I'm sure everything was slung to one side. I could hear the sound of her moving stuff around frantically, digging for the light. The car even dipped back as her weight shifted. She must have had to put her knee up on the bumper and stretch her arms into the back of the trunk. The talk grew less and less constant as she searched. I knew we should have just stuffed all of that gear into the back seat like Sandy suggested. All of this was running through my head. The sounds suddenly died out and her movements became less frantic and searching. Had she found it? Sandy rolled her window down just a smidge then. "You need help, Lena?" Sandy called hesitantly. "Or did you find it okay?" Lena didn't answer. We couldn't hear anything. It was utterly silent. I looked behind me through the rear window and could only see the trunk cover standing open like a yawning chasm. The blue sheen of it blocked out most of the window, and the view of the road behind us. Not that we could have seen anything anyway. The darkness was disquieting, and the fog obscured anything we might have seen. I sat frozen, as did Sandy. I could feel her watching me, almost afraid to speak. I turned to her. Her eyes said more than her mouth could have uttered. The fear was plainly written on her features. I, too, was afraid, but I was also racked with guilt. One of us should have gotten out of the car with Lena. I cursed my lack of courage. Just as I thought this, Sandy and I's predicament came back to me with a heart-thumping immediacy. If someone, or something, had gotten to Lena, it could get to us as well. Without further consideration, I reached over and locked Lena's door. Fear heightened my senses by degrees. I could feel the hum of the motor. I could hear the low crackling of the radio, so low now that no music could be heard. And through it all, a single question repeated itself in my mind. What had happened to Lena? I was seized with the desire to open the door and see what might be out there. I was seized with the desire to climb over the seat and start driving into the blackness. I was seized with the desire to hunker down in the car, shut off the engine, and wait for the dawn. All of these options seemed both marvelous and terrible. The first idea was obvious pitfalls. Suppose someone was out there waiting. Suppose Lena was already history and there was no point in heroics. Suppose a gruesome sight awaited me just beyond the edge of the trunk. The last thought I could not consider. The second option seemed just as loathsome, though it did present some promise. Suppose I did drive off and we got to safety. That would be wonderful. But suppose Lena was in trouble. Could I live with myself or abandon her? It seemed unforgivable. The last idea was equally cowardly in the end. We'd save fuel, of course, and in the light of dawn we'd be able to see something. But again, there was the sense that we'd be abandoning Lena. I finally decided to roll down the window as far as I could and lean out to see if I could get a glimpse of anything beyond the trunk of my car. Well, my eyes had adjusted somewhat to the darkness by then, and I felt sure I was able to make out something in the gloom. This also provided relative safety, because I did not actually have to leave the car. I considered grabbing Lena's cell phone and using the screen as a flashlight, but I couldn't risk dropping it, or worse yet, having it taken from me. It was, quite literally, our only connection to the world outside. I decided to do the best I could without it. The sound of the window going down unnerved me. It was like pulling down my blanket in a dark room when I was a child. There was an illusion of safety when the blanket was pulled up. There was the sense that the mix of cotton would save me, but that was a lie. The monster was still out there, waiting under the bed. I tried to listen, but the hum of the engine seemed unaccountably loud. I looked over at Sandy, about to tell her my plan, but she sat rubbing the back of her hand across her lips over and over again in a repetitive fashion, as though she was on the brink of a breakdown. Her breath was coming in short gasps, and she seemed about ready to either scream or cry. I listened to the sounds of the night for several moments, gathering my nerve, before turning my attention to the task of figuring out how I intended to ease myself out of the window. On the surface it seemed simple enough, but in practice it became logistically challenging. I finally decided to put my hands on the top of the car and use my feet to push myself up through the window into a sitting position. Thus situated, I felt sure that I'd be able to see beyond the trunk's open lid and possibly manage to get a glimpse of Lena somewhere. I tried not to think of reasons why Lena may have stopped talking to us, but that was impossible. Perhaps she'd heard a noise a few yards from the car and had gone to investigate. Maybe she'd gone silent because she was trying to hear something in the night. Neither of these suggestions was particularly comforting. What had she heard that she needed to investigate? Why did she need to remain silent? I could delay my plan no longer. If Lena was in trouble, I'd never myself Unsettling. I already had too many sins to count where Lena was concerned. I glanced across the seat at Sandy. Her hand was still at her lips, and her eyes regarded me with ill-disguised terror. I couldn't allow myself to consider her fears. I had to know if Lena was safe. It was the least I could do. On the count of 3, I took a deep breath and pushed myself up. The maneuver was far more awkward than I had anticipated. My elbow smacked the window frame smartly, and my feet slid on the cloth seats of Lena's car. In the end, I had to content myself with a partial view of what lay beyond the open trunk. However, this did not bother me too much. The idea of being up so high and out of the car so far actually terrified me. Already I felt terribly vulnerable. I attempted to get a look at our surroundings, but the scene was merely dim. Instead, I did my best to see if I could hear anything. The night was alive with a million tiny sounds coming from a distance. The bullfrogs groaned, the birds twittered, an owl called from far away. When added to all of this, the constant hum of the motor effectively drowned out any real sounds I might have heard. As if on cue, the moon came out from behind the clouds a second later. Silver outlined each tree and bush. Looking around, I strained to see something in the foggy obscurity. I found that I could make out the shapes of trees, but not much else. I leaned back further on the windowsill, trying to see beyond the open lid of the trunk, but I was met with only darkness. My lips tried to form Lena's name. I wanted to call out to her. I wanted to. But I found that I couldn't bring myself to say the words. A tiny voice in the very furthest reaches of my consciousness was whispering to me insistently that it was best if I remained silent. I exhaled suddenly, unaware that I'd been holding my breath. A frustration was mounting in me. I wanted to know, where was Lena? More than anything, I wanted Lena to casually appear from the back end of the car, as though nothing was wrong, the flashlight in her hand. But she did not appear. She did not appear, and she made no sound. None, that is, except the dragging. I became slowly conscious that just above the hum of the motor, a little ways off, there was something moving this way. It sounded like footsteps, but there was something not quite right about them. I listened intently, trying to better hear what was approaching, but no matter how I strained, I was as perplexed as ever. Step, drag, step, drag, step, drag. My breath became shaky as my heart began pounding even more incessantly in my chest. I looked this way and that, trying to capture a glimpse of what it was that was making the sound. Step, drag, step, drag, step, drag. As panic gripped me, I wrestled my way back into the car, hurriedly rolling up my window. Automatically, I scanned all 4 doors and noted that all of the locks were engaged. My God! Sandy's voice came out of the shadows, little more than a broken whisper. What is that? Her eyes were frightened. She scanned all of the windows in quick succession, trying to see everything at once. You don't think... She began again, but didn't finish. At first, I was somewhat bewildered by her words, but little by little they worked their way into my consciousness. You don't think... What don't I think? And just like that, I knew. That's just a story, Sandy. My voice sounded small and unconvincing to my ears. Stop pretending, she said, her tone controlled but shaky. You know what it is. Sandy, stop that. I tried to sound strong, brave, but I knew better. I sounded as broken and terrified as she. We're going to have to stay calm. Now stay calm. You're joking, right? She snapped. Next you're going to tell me it's nothing, even though you know that's a lie. She finished by laughing hollowly. Yeah, I'm sure it's nothing. Nothing but that creep. The one that goes around slitting people's throats after he breaks their legs." "Don't talk like that," I replied, my words shaky. I had to keep it together. I could not fall apart. "We don't know." "You don't think so?" she interrupted, her voice a sarcastic whisper. "What about Lena? Where is she? Huh? We're going to have to do something. We can't sit here." There was a long pause, as though she were considering something. Then she added, "If we wait much longer," and she took a deep breath, steadying herself, "we're not going to get out of here." "Stop talking like that," I snapped automatically, my tone far louder than I'd meant it to be, but I couldn't listen to her anymore. "Deep down, you know I'm right. He came for Lena, now he's going to come for us." "Don't!" I could feel my own hysteria rising. "Shh!" she interrupted me, an odd expression marring her features. "Do you hear that?" I listened. All of a sudden, everything was still. The movement outside had stopped. This should have comforted me, but it was somehow more terrible than the noises I'd heard before. We both looked at each other. Sandy sat quietly, her mouth open slightly as she concentrated. "I don't know what's going on," Sandy whispered, "but I know we got to get out of here." "But what about—" I protested. Sandy merely looked at me. Her thoughts were clearly written on her face. We couldn't consider Lena anymore. I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. My expression was drawn tightly, my skin was pale and hollow. We sat immobile for several moments. Indeed, it was so still that I'd almost forgotten that anything existed outside the car. The scream that shattered the eerie silence was deafening and terrifying, even more so when I realized that the noise had come from my own mouth. The trunk lid had slammed shut with an odious thud. Instinctively, we both turned to look at the back window. We gazed, transfixed, at the ghostly darkness and the eerie fog. I felt tears forming at the edge of my eyes. I was silently grateful for Sandy's presence, if only because she allowed me to face the ugliness of the situation with a companion. We waited what seemed like an eternity for something to happen next. And then it came. Step. Drag. Step. Drag. Step. Drag. I grabbed Sandy's arms in frenzy, my fingers twisting her skin and the fabric of her shirt together mercilessly. She winced, but I was beyond noticing. "What's happening?" I said through ragged breaths, then more hysterically, "What's happening?" Step, drag, step, drag, step, drag. He was getting closer. I knew that. I tried not to look through the windows to keep my eyes on Sandy and away from the road, but my resolve was short-lived. Eventually my curiosity proved unbearable, and I found myself gazing through the windshield once more. There, out in the fog, my eyes made out the shadowy silhouette of a man. His shoulders were slumped, and he wore an old hat. He did not move. He just stood there waiting, watching. Sandy didn't look. She didn't need to. Overcome with terror, she skirted between the pilot seats and took hold of the steering wheel. I screamed at her to stop, fearful of what might happen next in her panic, but she wouldn't listen. "I don't know about you, but I'm not going to just sit here and wait for some maniac to slit my throat. I'm getting out of here," she screamed. I wanted to say something logical, something reasonable, but my mind had gone completely blank. On some primal level, I knew Sandy was right. As crazy and nonsensical as everything seemed, Sandy was doing the most sane thing she could. Her hand found the gear shift and her foot found the accelerator. She took off at breakneck speed, the car careening wildly down the dark road. Instinctively, I grabbed the nearby seatbelt and snapped it into place. I doubted it would do much good, but I figured it couldn't hurt. "We shouldn't have come here. I knew we shouldn't have come here," she murmured as she drove. Up ahead, in the cool fog, it rose out of the mist. It was the bridge over Jefferson Creek. The old concrete bridge seemed ripped from another time, another place, not unlike a castle winding its way out of dense forest on a tall hill. I'd known we were close. I'd known, and yet its appearance still managed to send a deep chill into my stomach. Somehow we'd managed to change directions again. We were no longer riding parallel to the creek, but driving perpendicular to it. We were heading straight for the bridge. I heard the tires squeal savagely as we took a curve in the road at incredible speed. I felt the car sliding sideways. Impact was imminent. The last images I remember were the movement of the car, the limitless gloom wrapped in eerie fog, and the blurred shadow of a man standing at the edge of the bridge, waiting. I woke to the sight of spinning emergency lights. I was still in the car, buckled in. My first thought was for Sandy, but when I looked in the front seat I couldn't see her. We'd hit one side of the bridge, hard. I was startled by the face of a paramedic next to the glass. His flashlight was blinding. I couldn't think how they'd gotten there, who'd alerted them. All I knew was that they were all there. The ambulance, the fire trucks, the police cars. The bridge seemed alive with dizzying shades of red and blue. In a daze, I found myself opening the door. "Whoa," admonished the paramedic. "We haven't looked over you yet. Don't move." I felt gutted. I vaguely listened as he asked me standard questions. What happened? Can you hear me? Follow my finger. Do you feel any pain anywhere? Does this hurt? How about this? What were you guys doing out here? How did you... I began, still groggy and confused. "OnStar," the paramedic replied, matter-of-factly. "Their emergency services get a remote sensor indication that you'd been in a crash. They contacted us right away." Instinctively, I glanced at the dashboard, looking for some indication of a remote censoring system. The paramedic must have read my mind, because a moment later he leaned in, pointing. "See? Right there." He was pointing at a rearview mirror. "See that button that says SOS? I nodded half-heartedly. "That's the button you push if you need help. Sometimes people can't push the button because they're hurt. That's when the automatic sensor deploys." "Oh," was all I could think of to say. A moment later he turned away and went back to the ambulance. I attempted to stand up to try to walk, but I collapsed again. I made my way through the numerous emergency personnel trying to ask about Sandy and Lena, but whenever I brought up the others, they told me to rest, to go sit down. Why wouldn't they answer me? It was some time later when I learned the truth. Sandy, not belted, had been thrown from the vehicle. She was killed on impact, her legs smashed. Lena had been with us all along, in the trunk. She'd been folded like a pretzel, legs destroyed. I thought back to when she'd put her weight on the back of the car, leaning into the trunk. Is that when he'd grabbed her? I couldn't know. I, alone, survived. I'm not sure why. Maybe Lena was right. Maybe I am a dead battery where the spirit world is concerned. I don't care. I have no desire to talk to spirits anymore. Jessica? No, she's never been found, but I suspect she's out there like the others. Out there by Jefferson Creek. Out there in the endless night with Shuffling Joe.
Chilling tales for dark nights.